it's such a brilliant point, and I think just quickly to kind of touch on that, we can reintroduce, say, bighorn sheep to a mountain range, but unless the watersheds are healthy and unless their forage is available, and unless the systems are connected to other adjacent systems and populations where gene flow can take place and maybe seasonal habitat use can take place, it's really just a band-aid. And I think that's what we're experiencing today when we look at conservation. The really successful efforts are looking at systems, big systems, interconnected systems, as kind of the nursery grounds for biodiversity.
Welcome to the Into the Wilderness podcast. I'm your host, Byron Pace. It is the 28th of April. We're in April already. That means it's kind of spring. 28th of April, 2022. Spring is around the corner if you're in Scotland. It hasn't quite arrived yet. For those of you who don't know, this show is out... Well, this show is the Living with Nature series. So this is out every 4 weeks. But the podcast is out every 2 weeks, and it alternates between this show and the normal, more longer form conversational podcast where I speak to guests from around the world about all manner of things. They could be biologists, they could be explorers, they could be hunters, fishers, you name it. If they're involved in the great outdoors, they are somebody who fascinates me. When I'm not podcasting, I am I'm still do this when I'm podcasting, but I am also the conservation director at Modern Huntsman, which is a biannual publication dedicated to the sustainable use of wild resources and conservation. And you can get the whole back catalogue of 8 volumes now, the 8th one being the most recent, which is all about conservation on the continent of Africa. You can get that on modernhuntsman.com. In this show, I catch up with a friend and previous guest, ecologist Charles Post. In fact, he's also been a previous contributor to Modern Huntsman. Many regular listeners will be familiar with Charles. He's been on a few times. He is a master's graduate from Berkley. He's a member of the IUCN Species Survival Commission. He's a fellow at the Explorers Club. He's a filmmaker. And he is one of my favorite people on the planet to geek out with. But before we get to that, a quick shout out to the top tier Patreons for this month, who include Richard McNeil, Ronnie Speakman of rdcontracting.co.uk, James Marchington, the guys at South Esher Stalking, Thomas Cameron, Mark Zabrowski, and Colin Knight. If you would like to support the show, head over to patreon.com/Byron Pace. And with that done, please welcome Charles Post to the show. Charles, welcome to the Into the Wilderness podcast. And this is you've been on the show at least twice before, but this is a little different to the conversations that we've had before, which normally run to like hours. The Living with Nature series.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for having me, Byron. It's always a treat. I know that we could set aside 3 hours for this conversation, but I'm excited to dive into the questions that you do have and catch up and hopefully nerd out a bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm always into nerding out with you. If it involves salmon, well, mainly I was going to say birds is not really my thing. I definitely have a pretty limited knowledge about birds, but there is one thing is true. Whenever I see a dipper, whatever country I'm in the world, you are the person that comes into my mind when I see a dipper on a river. It's like,
oh,
Charles would love to see this.
I would. If you could only see the wall behind my computer, it's peppered with dipper illustrations and paintings, and so your assumption that I'm a total dipper fanatic is spot on.
Now, for people who maybe haven't heard the couple of conversations that we've had on the podcast before, and if you haven't, by the way, and you're listening, then I encourage you to go and search for Charles's name and find the previous shows we've done. But summarize like who you are and what you do, Charles, if that's at all possible, because you do so many different things. For those people who don't know who you are.
Yeah, I'll try my best. So yeah, I guess just to start, my background's in ecology. I spent nearly a decade at UC Berkeley studying ecology, first as an undergraduate with really a focus and a foothold on watershed ecology. So thinking about that confluence of the terrestrial and the aquatic worlds. After I completed my undergraduate studies, I spent a few years working in the field just to kind of get my feet wet. And I had a chance to work on old growth redwood trees, looking at some spiders that live in riparian corridors, looking at songbirds, looking at salmon, amphibians, aquatic invertebrates. And that was really just a formative time for me in the sense that I was able to be curious, right? And I was able to be a mentee and learn from scientists and thinkers who had been asking a lot of important questions for many years. So that was a really wonderful time where it led me to the kind of the next journey I took, which was graduate school. And I remained at UC Berkeley, studied under an absolutely brilliant woman named Dr. Mary Power, who's a celebrated food web ecologist. And it was under her kind of tutelage that I think, got to understand what it means to be a naturalist.
Okay.
And the one thing she told us was go and spend every day outside with a notebook observing before you even start asking questions, right? Get to know the world you're curious about before you start picking it apart. And that was
what great advice.
Yeah, it was wonderful. She gave every first year graduate student a field journal. And the task for that first summer was just fill it up. Before we even started our graduate work, it was just fill it up. And so, yeah, I finished graduate school 2015 with a master's degree in integrative biology, looking at, as you noted earlier, the American Dipper. Specifically looking at their behavior. And so it was amazing. And I left this long stay at Berkeley for a number of reasons, but one of them was I could see that I was surrounded by absolutely brilliant minds, people who are so passionate, so skilled, so tactful in their approach. And yet I was reminded constantly of this gulf between the work that was being done in academia by my friends and colleagues and the access to that information and the appetite for that information, the general public, the people I surfed with and hunted with and drank beers with on the weekend and hung out with. And so I think that's what led me into this current chapter of my life, which is one that at the moment is a bit dominated by this consulting work that I do, where I'm working with some relatively large outdoor hunting and tech companies that want to better understand sustainability, ecology, and how they as a company can position themselves in a way that can have positive impacts on their customers and the planet. Of course, I've made films over the years. I've written pretty extensively. I've shot photos for various publications over the years. Done field work over the years, but these days I spend quite a bit of time on my consulting work, and then have the odd creative project that keeps me entertained on the side.
Okay, so now people have an idea of where you're coming from, and they'll understand more why you're answering this set of 5 questions the way you're going to answer them. So the first one, and I feel like there's a million ways that you could answer this first question, but how do you connect with nature on a regular basis? I feel like that's your everyday, judging by your Instagram.
Yeah, it's, of course, the last 2 years have been quite extraordinary for a number of reasons, for probably everybody listening. And so while oftentimes throughout the year I'd be traveling quite extensively to work on a film or to shoot a photo story or to attend a conference or just take a trip, I've spent a lot of the last 2 years at home, and we live on 10 acres surrounded by hundreds, if not thousands of acres of open space and farmland and ranch lands. And so my daily connection with nature has been studying this place that I call home. A bit, I guess, to take a page out of Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac, to really understand the rhythms of a place. There's the Latin word genius loci, which is, the spirit of a place. And I think that's been my study. It's been in the garden, it's been on the land, it's been understanding the comings and goings of the seasons and the species that that pass through our land and the neighboring lands. And so that's been my connection. It's been really place-based, and it's probably the longest I've ever spent studying a patch of ground, and it's been incredible, totally transformational. And so that's really been my thing. I mean, we do live in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, so of course we're hiking and going in the mountains and going in the forest and jaunts from home, but I think home has been the study, at least in the last 2 years.
And I think that goes to show that you can do that in your back garden, even if your back garden is, I mean, you have a big garden, but even if you have a tiny back garden, there you can still do that because things are always changing. There is a rhythm to nature, to your point.
Yeah, no, it's so true. There's this wonderful word that that I constantly think about. It's called phenology, right? Phenology is like the sequence of events, the calendar, if you will, for nature, right? This is when the first bloom takes place, when the last leaf drops, when the swallows show up in March, whatever it might be. There's a calendar of events taking place, and even the smallest of gardens, and that might be, a migrating pollinator that comes through, or a songbird. And you're really connected to the broader living planet, right? Like, you might be on a migratory path. You might have a stream running through your town or through your yard. But even as you said, the smallest gardens are connected to this patchwork of nature. And I think that's a really wonderful kind of grounding force for people. And it certainly has been grounding for me in the last 2 years.
If I mean, I realize as I said that there might be some people who live in really, really urban environments who literally don't have a garden, and maybe there's one or two trees in the street outside their house, but they're largely surrounded by concrete. How could people like that, if they have this desire, or like they're listening to what you're saying, how do those people connect with nature?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I was born and raised just about an hour north of San Francisco on the Pacific Flyway. So one of the principal bird migratory pathways, highways, if you will, passes right through San Francisco. And I must have been in high school, so 2004 or 5, around then. I'd never seen a bald eagle before. While they're quite abundant now and widespread, I believe, in almost every state in the U.S., I hadn't seen one before. And the first one I saw in downtown San Francisco in October, flying north to south, headed south, but right through the city. And if you look at that migratory map, right, you can just Google Pacific Flyway or any other flyway for that matter across the globe. So many pass through cities. And oftentimes it's just a function of knowing that you should look up, or knowing that you should have a good look around. And while you may live in a high rise in the city in San Francisco, you are, 50 floors off the ground, or whatever it is, 10 floors off the ground. I mean, your eyes are in that flyway. I mean, thousands and millions of birds are passing through that city every year, and the same goes for many other cities across the world. And if it's not birds, stories of urban ecosystems coming to life at night, right, with raccoons and coyotes and migrating pollinators. You could have a little garden on your stoop, or a little garden on your fire escape, if that's legal. I don't know. But you'd be surprised, build it and they will come. I think that's kind of the sentiment that people across cities, across the globe are really being reminded of.
I love that though, because, for me, birds are the thing that carries me through the season. And I've probably mentioned this on a podcast before, but I know that when I hear the oyster catcher out my window in the morning for the first time of the year, that spring is coming. And I know that when I hear geese overhead for the first time, just when the temperature is changing, that for me, that's autumn. And that's all stuff that's happening above my head. And I happen to live somewhere that's very rural, and so nature is very much all around me, and sometimes in my house when bats are flying around. But it is the birds above my head that determine my year. So you're so right, Charles.
And, it's even in cities. I'm thinking about raptors returning to Central Park, which
Yeah,
has just
yeah.
been tremendously exciting for people, for urban birders. I'm thinking about peregrine falcons nesting atop skyscrapers across the globe. I mean, peregrine falcons are one of the most cosmopolitan birds of prey on the planet, and they are quite adept at picking a windowsill in a high rise or a bridge or an abandoned building. There's also a really wonderful story which I wanted to touch on a little bit further in our conversation, but thinking about uh, kittiwakes, which is the world's most abundant gull. It's a circumpolar gull that lives in the northern latitudes, um, really thriving in abandoned factories.
Yeah.
Uh, and it's amazing what nature can do if we give it a chance. And it's also amazing how much nature there is if we take a moment to really have a good look around.
Absolutely. So, with that in mind, to question two, we often focus on a lot of negatives in the world of conservation
Mm.
and with wildlife, but there are equally a lot of people and companies doing amazing things, particularly with how we connect with nature. Do you have any kind of standout examples of that?
Yeah, the first that really comes to mind, and to play into our shared love for salmon, I can't help but point out Bristol Bay. The Bristol Bay
Oh,
campaign
yes.
has been running literally. I was in high school, 2004. I had a Bristol no Pebble Mine sticker on my car, and so since then, and maybe it started a few years before 2004, but since then it's been an active campaign that has been, I would say, almost singular in its ability to combine the 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 love and the passion of wild salmon across unlikely partnerships. This is commercial fishermen. These are birders. These are recreational fishermen, hunters and anglers, outfitters. People across the globe have joined this groundswell to save one of the planet's last great salmon strongholds, which is also home to, I, I, you know, uh, an abundance of wildlife, and interconnected, open, intact ecosystems. And so I think Bristol Bay as a case study has just been not only amazing in the sense that it's been so um, long lived and resilient, right? It's been marching along for so many years, but it's also been really unifying for a lot of, like I said, maybe unlikely allies. And so that's
Do
been
you
an
think
effort that,
do you think it's that people began to realize what they were going to lose rather than necessarily like what they had? The connections they were going to lose if that mine went ahead?
yeah, I think especially for people on the west coast of the US, the east coast, or I guess I should say the northeast, and then of course throughout the UK, Iceland, Norway, salmon have been a major player in the shaping of the world, right? It's been a huge resource that sustained peoples for tens of thousands of years, if not more. And many of those places where salmon were once abundant, they are now non-existent, maybe locally extinct in some places. And so I think what was so, I would say, almost captivating about this Bristol Bay campaign is that in the 21st century, there are still places where salmon are so thick you could literally walk across their backs, where the ecosystem is so rich and so intact that the megafauna are thriving, that there are wolves whose coats have a tint of red to them because they eat salmon. I mean, there's these stories that are almost like otherworldly, and they exist. Like these are contemporary, and so I think really like the richness of that narrative, I just think captivated people, and was a strong unifier because if you grew up in places where salmon were once common, abundant, that was a thread, a narrative that you could pick up on and had some connection to, and so I think it was a lot of like we knew what we had lost, and it was amazing that there was still so much to save.
Yeah. And that fight now is over, as far as I understand it.
Yeah, that's
Which
my
is
understanding as
amazing to say
well.
that.
It is, and I want to say there are still a few efforts that need to be made to ensure those protections are permanent and not at the whim of a future administration. But I think at this moment, my understanding is that Bristol Bay has been protected, though I don't think the fight is at this point, over and done.
But we're definitely classing that as a win. And with that,
Yes, yes.
I want to ask you about conservation stories, because although that is pretty recent, it kind of feels like for the most part it's behind us. And you're somebody who's massively passionate about everything that you do. But is there one conservation story that you know of or are involved in, or in whatever manner that you are particularly passionate, maybe more than others right now?
Yeah, and I briefly mentioned this just moments ago, but the kittiwake story is one that has captivated me since I first encountered kittiwakes in the Arctic of Norway. What 4 years ago now, 3 years ago now, and I think what it actually draws a pretty tight parallel to the salmon example in the sense that kittiwakes, as I said, are the most abundant gull we have on Earth. They are circumpolar. They are incredibly abundant, common throughout their range. And when I was in Norway and I was encountering these birds nesting on rocky outcroppings and cliffs and nesting on roofs and on sills of old fish houses, I started doing a little bit of research just out of curiosity to know more about this species. And what I found was shocking. The research that had, first was being published maybe 20 years ago and continuing to this day was noting that as our planet warms due to climate change and as our oceans change due to shifts in temperature, shifts in current, therefore shifts in food availability, um, these models, these predictions were suggesting that kittiwakes may actually decline and in some places become locally extinct, like perhaps in our lifetime. And it reminded me of the salmon story because and I guess you can read we've all read this example, I'm sure in many different forms, but there are species that were so abundant we couldn't possibly fathom losing them all, right? Maybe it was the passenger pigeon, or maybe it was the bison of the North American continent. These just overwhelmingly abundant species. Maybe it was herring or sardines, and yet today we find ourselves with those species perhaps extinct, perhaps just a sliver of what they once were. And so it was almost like you were on the reverse end of that narrative with the kittiwakes. They were so abundant, they were so ubiquitous to the place, nobody seemed to be worried. I'd ask fishermen and friends about the kittiwake, and I kept hearing, "Oh, these are the birds of my childhood. This is the sound. The cacophony of kittiwakes is the soundscape of this place. It always has been, always will be. Nothing could ever change that. There are so many of these birds." And as I would go back to our house in the evenings to read, I was reading that kittiwakes in Norway, there is a possibility based on some of these predictions that they might be imperiled due to our changing planet and the climate crisis. And so that story has really kind of captivated me because again, we're at the beginning of that narrative. They're presently abundant, but they are slipping away slowly enough where people aren't really noticing. And so there's just a trickle of work popping in to the peer-reviewed literature, popping into the more popular literature. There's a story that National Geographic published in the last few years. Like I said, looking at these kittiwake hotels, and what they are these buildings that were previously abandoned that are now being set aside in urban environments for kittiwakes to nest, because it seems that nesting habitat is a limiting factor for them. And so, yeah, that's a story I want to learn more about. And as I mentioned to you earlier, we're moving to Norway full time in the spring, which feels crazy to say out loud, but we're just so thrilled.
Well, you got to do it
And
now. You've just announced it to the world.
I know. No, it's still surreal, but so I hope the Kittiwake story will be one that I can learn more about and hopefully help communicate.
It's interesting that very often we only realize that there's a problem when it breaks over some sort of threshold that means that people notice. And by that point, it's very often kind of gone too far to recover without human intervention. So I think that this is a really good example of how we really need to be aware globally of what's happening to species. And I suppose that is very much what the IUCN Red List is about, and being able to categorize the current state of populations around the world. But there's a lot of species out there, and some we don't even know yet. Some that exist, but we don't know they exist. So it's quite hard to care for something if you don't know it's there. It's actually one of the, and we're not going to go into this deep dive because otherwise we will be here for an hour, but it's one of the reasons that I very much prefer talking about ecosystem conservation rather than species conservation, because it is that great umbrella that kind of covers everything that exists within it, even that which we don't know yet.
It's such a brilliant point, and I think just quickly to kind of touch on that, we can reintroduce, say, bighorn sheep to a mountain range, but unless the watersheds are healthy and unless their forage is available, and unless the systems are connected to other adjacent systems and populations where gene flow can take place, and maybe seasonal habitat use can take place, it's really just a Band-Aid. And I think that's what we're experiencing today. When we look at conservation, the really successful efforts are looking at systems, big systems, interconnected systems, as kind of the nursery grounds for biodiversity and the refugia for biodiversity.
Absolutely. Now, to something a little bit more positive than that. Now, I without question, there will be people listening to this podcast who see you as somebody who inspires them to do things and integrate themselves, do positive, whether do things positive in the great outdoors, whether that just be litter picking or just caring and picking up a pair of binoculars, and like you were talking about right at the start of this podcast, just existing in nature and learning from it, because you post such long and incredibly detailed mini essays on your Instagram. But is there somebody who inspires you, Charles, in the outdoor space or in the conservation space?
Yeah, I have to say Chris Tompkins.
Okay.
She's the co-founder of Tompkins Conservation, Conservation Patagonia's their local effort in South America. But she is somebody who I feel just incredibly privileged to say is, a mentor of sorts, somebody that I'm able to connect with from time to time and learn from. And what inspires me about her is that she and her husband Doug, who tragically passed away a few years ago, have been able to conserve massive interconnected ecosystems in South America, purchasing ranch lands that used to really focus on livestock production and essentially allow them to be rewilded, to reintroduce jaguar and to reintroduce caiman and the kind of the keystone species, the species that really help keep that fabric intact, that ecological fabric intact. And so she not only has, I think, tremendous vision, but she's also figured out a way to build, to cultivate buy-in, right?
Which is so important.
Conservation is just so important, especially in this day and age when we're all so connected and our attention is the competition for our attention, right? The attention economy is an incredibly competitive space, whether it's ads or news headlines, friends, family, whatever it is, right? We're being pulled, our mind's eye is being pulled in so many different directions constantly. And so to find somebody in the conservation space that has successfully built an army, one that has had the success that Tompkins Conservation has had, I think is incredibly unique, especially looking at the millions of acres that have been protected is especially unique. And so she's somebody that is a bit of a, I guess you could say like a cheerleader, somebody who is putting those whispers in your ear to, forge ahead, keep on, don't give up, be bold, be audacious. Activism is building an army. That's what she always says. So find that thing that keeps you up at night and fires you up in the morning and build a community around it. And I think that's where we're finding a lot of these successes in the conservation space.
Brilliant. What a great suggestion for somebody who inspires you. And with that, we get to the last question. And this always feels like an impossible question, especially for somebody like you. But is there one particular standout memory that you have where you felt, wow, that is what connecting with nature is about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first that comes to mind, I might have two quick.
You can give two. I'll let you. Share. Just because it's you, Charles, you can have two.
Thank you, Byron. Thank you. I'll keep them brief. The first is, again, back to salmon. I grew up in a town peppered with redwoods, kind of right where the redwoods meet the oak woodlands, right? So it's like that confluence of the fog and that kind of temperate rainforest where it meets that lee side of the fog belt. But we had salmon. So growing up, just over my back fence, there was an old salmon stream. Years before I was born, the Army Corps of Engineers, in their brilliance, filled it up with cement and turned it into basically a storm drain to move floodwaters out of the valley and into the bay. But as a young kid, every fall, a few salmon would make their way up to the dam where the floodgate was. And I remember my dad, advocating for us to climb the barbed wire fence and get down into that storm drain. And we, in one particular moment that I'll never forget, caught this coho salmon, put it in a bucket, brought it out of the storm drain, and walked it upstream. And that was the moment where I realized we have done something to this planet. And it's going to take people like me in that moment to do something about it. Because that salmon there was no way forward, no way ahead. Like that salmon's life for millennia, it had evolved to do just what it was doing. And now it had its nose butted up against a piece of cement. No way to go further upstream. And so as a young kid, I was in maybe elementary school, young, like I don't even remember how old, but one of my earliest, kind of nature moments. And that was when like I said, I realized that we needed to be proactive, that one small moment could have massive impacts, to watch that salmon swim through the alders in the Bay Laurel a little bit further upstream was like a moment I'll never forget. So I think that was what really triggered me to be involved and to like get my hands dirty, and really realize that a lot of this change is gonna take place where the cement, touches the earth, right? Like that confluence where wild and urban environments or suburban or whatever environments kind of dovetail. And then I think quickly that the second example for me that was maybe a bit more recent was the first bird I ever banded, the first songbird I ever banded. To hold a little warbler, just a few ounces in your hand, right? Brilliant yellow, its little eyes staring up at you, its
I
heart
love
racing.
a yellow warbler.
I mean, there's something so just captivating, something so powerful about that moment, to feel its body pulsing in your hand. It's so gentle, but you also recognize it's not lost on you that this bird is migrating thousands of miles, perhaps, taking this epic journey twice a year. And you're the first human to ever hold it in your hands. And I think in that moment, I was reminded of the incredible responsibility we have, that these wild lives are resilient, but they're also incredibly fragile. And that was a moment where I really started to pay more attention to birds, to migrations, and to these threads of wildlife that really bind hemispheres, right? The tree swallows that live in my garden for 3 months of the year are in Nicaragua right now. And there's maybe a family in Central America that's keeping an eye on the birds that I keep an eye on all summer. And I think that's something that's like incredibly special.
I love that, Charles. You speak with such passion and eloquence when it comes to nature. It's really, really rather beautiful. So thank you so much for sharing your living with nature. I have no doubt that people will be thinking to themselves, I need to spend more time, because listen to how this man speaks about his time with nature. So I appreciate your time. I appreciate the work that you're doing, and thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Byron. It's always a treat.